Greetings from Accra, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you may be. My name is Georgie Chikata. I'm based at the Institute of African Studies at the College of Humanities at the University of Ghana. And I'm really pleased to be your moderator for the 10th event in the dialogue series under the theme Specters of Crisis, Rays of Hope. The dialogue series are a fortnightly event, and today's topic is the Wretched of COVID-19 in Brazil, Colonial Specters of an Announced Crisis. Our speaker today is Professor Davison Mendes Faustino, also known as Davison Nkosi. He's a professor at the Department of Health, Education and Society and the graduate program in social work and social policies at the Federal University of Sao Paulo. His research is focused on themes of racism and health, capitalism and racism, and anti-racist social thought. He's the author of several publications on these subjects, including Frantz Fanon, A Revolutionary, Particularly Black, in 2018, to The Dispute Around Frantz Fanon, The Theory and Politics of Contemporary Fanonisms, in 2020. He's also co-editor of the Interfaces of Genocide in Brazil, Race, Gender, and Class in 2019. He will be ably supported by our discussants, Professor Parisieiros, professor at the Federal University of ABC in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and faculty member of the undergraduate programs in economic sciences and the sciences and humanities, and the postgraduate programs in world political economy and human and social sciences. Paris is the editor of Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy, and co-editor with Praveen Jha and Walter Chambati of the recently published book, Rethinking the Social Sciences with Samoyu. Before our speaker and discussant take the floor, I'd just like to make some brief remarks. You may recall that 5 of our dialogues so far have focused on the ravages of COVID-19 on the world economy and on working people of the global south. In these events, speakers such as Prabhat Patnaik, Michael Witter, Atiro Guillen, Jayati Ghosh, Nancy Kachingwe, Nilanjana Mukia, Gabriela Mendes, and Achana Prasad have provided us with evidence, insights, and perspectives on COVID-19 from the scholarly traditions of radical political economy and feminism. Several of them highlighted the struggles of working people in general and women in particular for their very lives, for their livelihoods and dignity in these hard times. Today's focus on Brazil continues with our deliberations on COVID-19. Its point of departure is critically important. The focus this time is on the epidemiological indices of infection and mortality to COVID-19, as well as the Brazilian state's health responses. Brazil is among a small group of countries such as the United States of America, Tanzania, and Belarus, with hyper right-wing populist governments led by COVID-19 denialists. Secondly, the presentation will answer several critical questions, including why Brazil is so badly affected by COVID-19 in terms of infections and fatalities, and also why the most badly hit by COVID-19 is the Afro-Brazilian population. In doing this, the presentation will shed light on Brazil's particular branch of capitalism, which is underpinned by a history of slavery and colonization and neocolonialism. This focus on infection, mortality, and racialized capitalism is critical for understanding COVID-19 effects and responses globally, and also drawing lessons that are relevant beyond Brazil. In many countries outside Africa with significant Black and brown populations, particularly in Europe and the Americas, the ravages of COVID-19 are being disproportionately experienced by these populations who tend to dominate the lower ranks of health and other kinds of care work, including domestic work, and therefore are on the front line, or who are in precarious work, who are poor, discriminated, marginalized, and faced with existential challenges arising from the long shadow cast by slavery and colonization. Brazil, which is home to the largest population of Africans outside Africa, is no different in this regard, and is perhaps the best laboratory for analyzing the specificities of racialized capitalism, given its complicated history, both as a sub-imperialist power and land grabber in places like Africa, while also being a victim of its fair share of land grabbing by transnational corporations and the local elite. Brazil is a theater of the Lula revolution, whose social policies such as Bolsa Familia and far-reaching affirmative action policies in higher education, health, and land restitution brought hopes of racial and class justice and galvanized workers, peasants, and women's movements and captivated the global South as a whole. Under the current Bolsonaro regime, Brazil has returned to its old ways of hyper-neoliberal economics, massive repression, and populism. We are therefore extremely fortunate to have Davidson talk us through these gyrations in Brazilian politics and their implications for the pandemic. Today's session is occurring at a very special time, Black Consciousness Month in Brazil, the high point of which is November 20th. On this day in 1695, Zumbi of Palmares, leader of the resistance to slavery in colonial Brazil, was slain by the Portuguese colonial army, putting an end to a century of resistance by the Quilombo of Palmares, a settlement of Afro-Brazilian people in the northeast of Brazil who had liberated themselves from enslavement. Before our speakers take the floor, followed by the discussants, I'd like to acknowledge the partnerships that have anchored this dialogue series. The core partners are the Agrarian South Network, the Samoyo African Institute for Agrarian Studies in Zimbabwe, and Action Aid India. The supporting partners are the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies at JNU in India, the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, Global University for Sustainability in Hong Kong, China, postgraduate program in World Political Economy and the Educational Technologies and Languages Unit at the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. Now, I would like to say a word about our question and answer section. It is particularly important to us that after the presentations have been made, we hear from you who are participating in this webinar. Please send your written questions in Zoom and Facebook, and these will be posted to the speaker. The dialogue is in English. However, written questions can be in any other languages, and they'll be translated and forwarded to the moderator, to me, the moderator, by the team. A recorded video will appear later with Portuguese and Spanish subtitles. So I encourage you to be attentive and keep the questions coming once we open the floor. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Davidson to take the floor for 40 minutes or so. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Good morning. Thank you, Professor Tiscata, for this great introducing. I am so happy for stay here with you and Professor Parzieros in this important conference, important event. And well, I am not a fluent English speaker, so I will use PowerPoint to minimize any accent problem. But my presentation calls the Wretched of COVID-19 in Brazil, Colonial Spectre of an Announced Crisis. Let's start with this image. This image is the perfect portrait of pandemic in Brazil. We have here a black man, a Brazilian black man in a precarious job, while a white man jogging during quarantine. This image is emblematic to talk about the colonial aspect of an announced crisis of pandemic in Brazil. My presentation will be divided in three parts. First, I will talk about the Brazilian response to pandemic and comments also Bolsonaro's response. But after I will talk about the colonial way of Brazilian capitalism and the role of racism in the current crisis. Well, uh, I will I will begin with David Harvey quotation when he said that it's important to refuse the idea of nature as outside of and separate from culture, economy, and daily life. There is, from this standpoint, no such thing as a truly natural disaster. Viruses mutate all the time, but the circumstance in which a mutation become life-threatening depend on human action. That quotation is important for us because Brazil is the second country most affected by COVID-19 in the world. Uh, but epidemiology is important here, but that area is not just a natural science in Brazil, but not only in Brazil, in the world. It is the social condition that explain the epidemiological dynamics and explain in Brazilian case why the death numbers skyrocketed in Manaus, for example. Manaus is the heart of the Amazonia. It was necessary to open collective graves to bury the bodies because there was no space in the cemetery. But other point that is not much talked about in Brazil is the racialization of death. We can see here in this chart, in this graphic, uh, 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 that there is a kind of increase. There is a decrease in white people hospitalization between April and May. Uh, but we have increase for Black people hospitalization in the same period. The same happens with death numbers. We have a decrease of death of white people and increase in Black people. We have that data, but the Minister of Health stopped offering data disaggregated by race. But seeing that information, we can imagine the progress of this trend in the time. Well, another problem when we see pandemic in Brazil is the evolution of the pandemic, because we can observe a large increase in case of death between February and June, but we have not institutional and articulated response to that increase. I will talk more about that. But after we had a kind of plateau uh, uh, in between uh, May and July. And it's interesting because after when the number of deaths decreased between August and October, that happened without organized government intervention to stop the pandemic. That's my point, because it was not uh, uh, that's my point, because that's a kind of project, a government project. Today, in Brazil, when we see the numbers, we talk about the second wave of coronavirus in Brazil, but we didn't even get over the first wave. It's funny to say in second wave because we continue in a pandemic problem. My key issue is how it is possible. How can a country protected, because we are protected by a universal and free health system, how can a country like Brazil be so affected by a pandemic as this? And other question is what explain the racialization of that? I want to talk with you about that. Uh, it's important to talk about the Bolsonaro government to understand Brazilian response. Bolsonaro began his government in 2019, and it's so important to see that moment because he was elected in 2018 after a parliamentary coup that overthrew President Dilma Rousseff, uh, and his government have been marked by the defense of democratic restriction and calling for return for dictatorship, but also an ultra-liberal political platform that consists in privatization of public assets, dismantling of social security and labor rights, and intensification of job insecurity and Uberization. Uh, it was it is also a kind of weakening of the public research structure. That is important because Bolsonaro's government is based on attacks on university considered leftists, and government planning are based usually in fake news or a kind of anti-scientificism and common sense belief. That is important because when this was the Brazilian political and social conjuncture when the coronavirus arrived in Brazil, and we had difficult to to work with it because that is our scenario. Uh, uh, one or on of the first case sorry our first case of infection was a rich white man that was traveling in Italy. In the first moment, pandemic was majoritarily the rich people were majoritarily affected by COVID in the first moment. But one of the first case of death was an elderly maid black woman. She worked in the home of an infected rich family. That is a photography, a image of pandemic in Brazil, because there are an unequal distribution of of uh, uh, of pandemic in Brazil. But when coronavirus arrived, what in Brazil, what's happened next was completely strange because our government was marked by a confused response. In the first moment, Bolsonaro said that coronavirus was a little flu that was being overestimated, and we didn't need to do anything. But after, when pandemic was so strong and was impossible subestimate it, his posture was marked by a kind of ambiguity. Uh, while the Minister of Health defended the quarantine, our president took part in a public act without mask in the same moment. It's important to say that that act, that street act, was for a return of dictatorship. Uh, but that moment uh, was important to understand our response, because that ambiguity uh, was marked for a kind of polarization. Bolsonaro's create a polarization between health and economy. That was so problematic polarization, because puts Brazilian society to choose uh, which is better. He said, we cannot sacrifice the economy to guarantee quarantine, and he chose economy, uh, but not health. Uh, that moment was marked also for a dispute between state and federal government, because I am talking about March and April, for example, when state government began create some response to pandemic, some kind of quarantine, local quarantine, or local interruption of circulation. But in that moment, uh, Bolsonaro was against this initiative, uh, and we had a kind of fight between federal and state government. Uh, but after uh, we 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 have seen a kind of accommodation from above, because the fight between state and federal government stopped, and both create a kind of agreement for economy. If Bolsonaro created that polarization between health and economy, or bourgeoisie or government choose economy against health, and both uh, stopped efforts, public efforts to uh, to minimize circulation, social circulation. That was so problematic for population, for worker, and etc. That period was marked by a full opening and full opening of economy activity. If we have not an institutional efforts to stop circulation, security misery have become an individual responsibility. But whole poor people from favela, from people that's working a precarious job, can guarantee his epidemiological security when government uh, don't offer social conditions for that. That's the question for us. That maybe explain our numbers of pandemic of pandemic. And but uh, how 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 analyze this scenario? I think there are different line, different interpretative line. Uh, First, it's important to say about it. There are ultra liberal line that guide governmental efforts, and they just now continue creating efforts to contain the not contain pandemic, but contain uh, efforts to contain pandemic. You know, the ultra liberal interpretation create the idea that quarantine, for example, is the problem, is an economic problem, and we need to stop with it to improving our economy. The idea is that efforts to contain the pandemic generated an economic crisis. That is a government line interpretation, but there are so much intellectuals in Brazilian bourgeoisie, in communications media that agree with that line. There is other interpretative line that I want to talk about. I call like as liberal and democratic left. They call in administrative incompetence of Bolsonaro to stop a pandemic in Brazil, or they some intellectuals talk about rise of new fascism. That's 2 points are so important, but I think that there are other important points that we need to see to understand our conjuncture. And I agree with the Marxist left intellectuals when they call that our scenario can be understood in the context of national effect of the structural crisis of capital. I agree with them, but my argument is that current conjuncture can be better understood also taking into the colonial roots of capitalism, of Brazilian capitalism, and the rule of racism in the reproduction of Brazilian capital. I will talk more about that because we I would like to talk about the combination of three aspects to understand Brazilian capitalism and current conjuncture, because there are a great debate about the particularity of Brazilian capitalism, and but I think the José Chazin's approach is so important to understand our particularity when he said that our capitalism is a colonial capitalism. He talks about the colonial way of Brazilian capitalist identification, and that's so important to understand Brazil, because our capitalism was born from colonialism. That's important because that creates particularity to understand our history, but also our present. Uh, and we was born from colonialism and slavery and originarios people genocide that create a particularity for our capitalism. But the result uh, was a society marked by overexploitation of the workforce, marked by a fragility of democratic institutions. Uh, it's important to talk about it because our history after the slavery was an alternation between restricted democracy and dictatorship. We had alternation between them, but our capitalism was marked also by a high concentration of income and inequality. Uh, it's important to talk about it because important intellectuals that talk about that particularity don't talk about racism, but racism here was an important social barrier and an instrument of unequal poverty distribution. Racism was important in slavery system, but continued being important after that whole as a part of that capitalist particularity. And but unfortunately, the left intellectuals, the majority of left intellectuals in Brazil don't talk about racism. That is a problem. But the first problem that I want to talk is that our capitalism uh, is a particular way of capitalism structured by a colonial way of identification. And it is important because uh, the period of consolidation of this colonial Brazilian capitalism ended with the mondialization of capital, and the last decades we are in the other stage of that particularity, and that moment was marked by a subordinate insertion of Brazilian capitalism into the globalization. I prefer to say mundialization of capital. I base my point of view in Steven Mesaros and Goretz Sobrinho, uh, because I want to think that we had a colonial capitalist marked by overexploitation of workforce, but when we go inside the structural crisis of capital marked by mundialization, that particularity creates particular problems for us, or create a kind of intensification of results of structural crisis of capital. Uh, uh, Goretti Sobrinho said that our insertion in the globalization of capital was a subordinate manner, and it's deepened the effect of structural crisis of capital, uh, uh, based uh, on dismantling social and labor rights. And we had in the last period, we have some labor rights, so some social rights conquisted by a strong fight in the last decades, but this moment represented a dismantling of these social and labor rights, but also increase of precarious work and income concentration. And here again, in this current moment, again, racism is a fundamental element that define who can or cannot access uh, uh, social social access riches, but accesses also health. That's important because that's help us understand the scenario, the Brazilian scenario when coronavirus arrived, because we had a combination of factors, a combination of a combination where a rich country, but unequal country, based by overexploitation and exclusion of great part, a big part of their population, uh, in the context of precarization of work and attacks against uh, uh, against rights conquisted in the last decade. But also racism creates unequal access to health, because health is not only a biological biological issue, health depends of social condition, and racism create in Brazil a different access to health condition. Uh, that's the point to understand the racialization of death by COVID-19, for example. I think racism uh, in Brazil is important to understand the current economic crisis because, first of all, racism naturalizes social inequality, blame the victims. And when we blame the victims, uh, we cannot problematize or fix the real social problem. And racism said today that poverty is a blame of black people because black people are not black people don't fight for themselves. For example, we can listen it. Black people is the in Brazil are the majority of population, but black people are in the worst space black people living in the precarious condition in Brazil. And racism naturalize uh, racial inequality. Uh, in that cause for this conference, we say race is important, but I think uh, maybe race are not so important. But before racism is important to understand how the idea of race creates difference of condition of life in Brazil. But racism naturalizes social inequality. Racism offers unequal living condition and influenciate, if you think health, for example, influenciate being born, growing up, getting sick and dying. We have some researchers showing how racism influenciate health conditions and possibility of death. But racism influenciates also the access to healthcare services and healthcare equipments, healthcare public equipments. There are differences of access for black and white people in Brazil, and that's topics are important to understand why black people in Brazil has more death by cancer or chronic kidney disease or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Black people are most affected by heart condition or cardiomyopathy or obesity or type 2 diabetes mellitus. Uh, uh, that are diseases that increase the risk for death from COVID-19. It's important to understand the social condition to understand to talk about the pandemic in Brazil, but the social conditions are marked by racism in our unequal society. That's the point that I want to talk about. But racism creates also a kind of indifference to social inequality, indifference about Black lives, indifference about suffering created by combination between capitalism and racism. I wrote Black Lives here because we today we have more of 160,000 deaths by COVID-19, but without commotion. Uh, I think uh, is important to talk about this because Brazil has the most violent and lethal policy in the world. 8 out of 10 young people murdered in Brazil are black. It's happening before pandemic, uh, uh, but Brazilian society was only touched by the 10 due to the mobilization on behalf of George Floyd's murder. We only started talking about it when the problem was visible in US. Racism creates the indifference, and indifference allows in our numbers of death, and indifference is the impossibility of commotion with that death. Uh, I think racism is important to speak about new fascism, but I think racism is the key for an even distribution of the national effect of our subordination insertion in the structural crisis of capital. Bolsonaro is just the most recent and visible expression of an ancient Black and indigenous genocide process. It's an important expression, but the problem in Brazil didn't begin with Bolsonaro. That's important to speak. Uh, well, uh, uh, against this scenario, we need to talk about race of rope because it's our subject. I think the rays of hope are the possibility of combination of struggle that is both anti-racist struggle, anti-neocolonial struggle, and anti-capitalist struggle. Without that combination, we probably will continue in this scenario, even when Bolsonaro go home. Our challenge is think how to think together that's approach to building a new society and a new hope. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Davison, for that really interesting intervention. I'd now like to ask Professor Paris Yeros to make his comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you, Davison, for this illuminating talk. I will just take a few minutes to add some thoughts and make try to provoke you a bit more as to especially the rays of hope that you mentioned at the end. You started by noting that Brazil has a universal healthcare system. This is important to note because it was the result of a new constitution in 1988, which brought in a whole series of rights. It's a very modern constitution. In fact, it was the first constitution that guaranteed universal suffrage. Before that, Brazil, even the constitution had been suspended by the military regime. Even that constitution precluded universal suffrage. It was a qualified vote for the literate. Yeah, so it is a really Brazil in 1988 makes a transition that is very similar, in my view, and I say this for our colleagues and friends who are following this event. It was very similar to what happened in South Africa. It is a type of in a strict sense, a type of decolonization, yeah, of an internal type of colonialism, yeah, which was a very which precluded any type of serious, sustained challenge to a colonial myth, a colonial order of segregation. Yeah. So from 1988, the Constitution brings in universal suffrage, brings in a universal health system, all kinds of rights for demarcation of the Quilombola lands, for a series of policies for land reform and so forth. So that is the starting point. Nonetheless, yeah, as you also mentioned, it was a moment of political opening, yeah, at the same time as the economy was resubordinated to a neoliberal framework, economic framework. So the contradiction was given. Yeah, the contradiction was only going to get worse, and the chasm between the reality, yeah, and the Constitution was going to be very clear, and it was only going to widen. So, in fact, in the 2000s, you mentioned the violence precisely during the Lula years, which the social policy side reached its apex. There was also the killing also reached its apex. In fact, it jumped to levels that were comparable to any war situation in the world. From 2003 through the new anti-drug policy, the war on drugs, we had a type of scenario where violent deaths started jumping to 50,000, 60,000 per year and being sustained from over a decade to, if you count it all in, to 700, 800,000, almost a million people dead in 10, 15 years. This is comparable, violent deaths we're talking. This is comparable to any war, at that time the war in Iraq was ongoing. The death toll in Iraq, there's various counts, but around 500,000 people died in that decade, and this is Brazil was above that. Yeah, so it was really, that's the type of contradiction that needs to be brought into light when we talk about how the fascist state has returned now in a much fuller way in the midst of a pandemic. This justifies the use of the term genocide. It never ended, and it has escalated now in a so-called democratic conditions. So that's the one issue that I think needs to be very clear. There has been a very deepening chasm between the law and the reality, the Constitution and the reality on the ground, as far as the Brazilian political process is concerned. The other issue I think that I just want to frame, just to go a bit just beyond Brazil. Yeah, so we maybe bring into focus tendencies that are ongoing in the region. There also has been a certain type of interpretation which sees a type of left turn in the 2000s, yeah, which somehow has come to an end. Let's say, that's the interpretation. There was a cycle of left governments, left movements, a left tide. Yeah, this is true, of course, and this is the backdrop, let's say, to the pandemic. Before the pandemic struck, but at the same time, it is the chasm, the contradictions that Brazil has had have also repeated themselves everywhere else. In fact, at the same time as the left gained force in Latin America, the coup d'etats also escalated. Throughout this period, there has been coups systematically, starting with Haiti at the turn of the century, then attempted coups and coups that were successful in their objectives. So Haiti, Bolivia, Venezuela, there they were not successful. Then there's Honduras, Paraguay, yeah, all the way back to Brazil. Yeah, there's a series of coups that have been of this last 20 years. Yeah. So the contradictions have been there the whole time. Yeah, and the process is ongoing. So that's one of the, this explains not only Brazil but also Peru has had a very serious pandemic. Central America has been struck very severely by the pandemic. So it's not it is it seems like the Americas as a whole has been has been is has been struck uh, very severely, with the exception of Cuba and of course the cases that uh, were more successful in many ways in tackling this pandemic. And in all cases, yeah, it's a race question. In fact, yeah, from the U.S. until the Southern Cone. This is the new world, and after talking about the Americas, where uh, the original sin of the modern world uh, occurred, the great genocides of the last 500 years, and which are questions which have never been resolved, and are continue to structure all these societies up to the present. Yeah, democracy is a very recent phenomenon, and it's been a highly contradictory and violent phenomenon in all these cases. The other one more issue that I want to bring out is the type of social structure uh, that has evolved. Uh, the structure. The labor market has also become um, has its own particularities. Of course, there's similarities to the rest of the world, the South at least, um, about the sense that uh, labor work is has a very uh, unstable relationship with salaried labor. With permanent labor, there's a very difficult relationship, episodic, periodic, informal relationship with salaries in this labor market. On account informal, autonomous type of labor predominates. Yeah. Um, and in the pandemic, uh, this has worsened very severely. Um, some data that came out just today from research done at the University of Campinas has shown that the delivery services, which have become so essential during the lockdown and the pandemic, have brought in, have inaugurated a new, just deepened the situation, whereby 40% of those that work in delivery service now work hours a day. Yeah, and also all across the board, incomes in this have dropped. We're back to a type of um, situation where labor laws, those victories that were realized in the past, have become you know meaningless uh, when we look at the realities of how the labor situation has evolved. Now, the last so I think that's just one dimension that also explains the uh, the way the virus, the pandemic has evolved, because there is a population, a large part of the working class, that lives in very precarious conditions, cannot stay at home during a lockdown. Yeah? It's impossible to make ends meet, to survive under these conditions. And this is precisely the population which which you've been talking about within the race structure of Brazil. The final point, and I think this is the question that you can respond to anything that I have said, of course, but a specific question. You spoke about the rays of hope. There is a resurgence of a black movement, a unified black movement in Brazil, which came together, in fact, before the pandemic, yeah, in the when just a year before the pandemic, when over 100 movements, black movements in Brazil, came together into a coalition. Yeah. And this has given a new life to a critique of Brazilian society, and constant intervention in the public debate. Yeah. Um, with a new capacity to articulate a national question. Yeah? Whereas other social movements in the country may be rural or urban, some have an ideology of focused on food sovereignty, um, others on urban housing for the urban homeless. Um, but in the case of the new unified coalition of black movements, we see that this coalition has been able to articulate a full range of issues that are applicable to urban situations, rural situations, related to health, education, um, uh, women's rights, LGBT rights, the whole spectrum. It seems to me that the new black movement is almost like a political party. Of course, it doesn't have that kind of structure, uh, but in the sense that it has a vision of the whole national question, which other social movements normally do not have. So I think maybe I just throw that out as a question, or a comment to which respond. Anyway, of course, any other comments I've made, you may also either respond or ignore. I think I will just end there and let our colleagues also jump in to make their own contributions.
Mm. Thank you very much, Paris. I think I'd like to ask Davison if he would respond to your comments before we open the floor for other comments.
Okay, thank you, Parisieros. Are important issues to talk. Well, I will start talking about the universal health system, because it was created in the context of the constitution, the new constitution. We was ending a dictatorial period, and in that moment, uh, uh, there was a social pact. Some intellectuals calls about new republic, and that pact, that social pact, was marked by an advance of social struggle, because there was a rising of social movement in that moment, and constitution uh, 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 was marked by incorporation of some popular demands. Uh, uh, I agree that that process is similar what's happening in South Africa, but the pact did not break with the colonial past. That's the point to understand today the current scenario, because that incorporation of social demands uh, was not uh, was not part of a radical break of colonial past and colonial force and uh, uh, a big bourgeoisie, Brazilian bourgeoisie, for example, and that pact for because this that create limits uh, for this process. The Lula government, for me, has been marked for was marked for this contradiction, because in one hand we had an increase in the in the consumerism of the poor people, for example, and the working class, and but also on the other hand we had a big increase in the how can I say, increasing in the riches of big rich people, uh, but was a moment, Lula government was a moment of real incorporation of popular demands from black movement, feminist movement, worker and worker class demands for labor rights. Is right, but also the pact, the social pact with or industrial and financial bourgeoisie creates difficult to real attend of these demands, and uh, and the power keep in the same hands, same hands that was in the dictator period. We didn't dismantling dictatorial institution, military policy, and land concentration, etc. But we had a real increase of attempts of some social demands. Was a contradiction, a contradictory period. But I think that's important to understand how uh, Lula and Dilma government was discarded by our bourgeoisie when this pact was not interesting for them, because that moment was possible because there was international condition for that in the international market. But when this pact, this project was not interesting for our bourgeoisie, that project was discarded by uh, uh, parliamentary coup. Uh, I think it's important because the uh, we had important gains for worker class in this period, but that gains will not deep sufficiently to continue after the end of Lula and Dilma period. That's important for me. And it's important to understand that moment also, because uh, and for that I am calling for colonial way, that calling for importance to understand our colonial way, because we have not finished it roots. Uh, uh, is really capitalism was market world. Capitalism was marked by an uneven and combined develop and periphery, and capitalism in periphery was structured by overexploitation, and in our case, our colonial case, our capitalism was structured by indigenous genocide and black slavery, and that create a particular kind of capitalism marked by a fragile democracy. Florestan Fernandes spoke of interrupted decolonization. It's interesting because our decolonization began in 19th century, but our process of decolonization was interrupted by uh, uh, or how can I say, our decolonization were interrupted, and our dominant class choose the way of subordination of international capital, but that was structured by over exploitation, and over exploitation can be continued with a fragile democracy and institutional violence that's mark a kind of state and a kind of political institutionality. Our institutionality are marked by violence and naturalization of violence. I think this is important to understand our achievement and also our failures, because, for example, universal system of health is a great example, because we call in Brazil SUS, Sistema Único de Saúde, unical system of health. Our system is universal and free, and we did our definition of health is a definition of health like a right, a universal right. That was an uh, important thing, but our system was marked after Constitution in 1818. Or we had color government, and the government choose for new liberalism, and that create the impossibility to put our healthy system of to practice the principles of health system, and create difficult to guarantee the gains, the social gains present in constitution, especially in health. And today we have an important health system. I think for us in Brazil, the rays of hope pass for defend our health system. Is important task for left force defend health system, because it is an uh, important part of our fight of work labor, our labor class, work class. But SUS, systema, universal system of health, has real difficult to guarantee to practice its principle, because there are economic limits created by economic shoes for our government. That explains, for example, the context of dissemination of pandemic, because uh, it's interesting, because I think if we didn't have universal system of health, our numbers will be so big. It will be more than United States, for example. I think our universal system of health was the big wall to pandemic, but the project of our government was dismantling our universal health system to create condition to private market of health, but he could not uh, do that. I think if we can talk about incompetence of this government was to put in order his project of dismantling, because we are in this process, but there are a resistance force to protect that 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 history, that possibility to cover our population, and but to think raise of hope for me is important to consider our gains, our social gains, and consider the, for example, that today there is an important insurgence of the Black movement in Brazil. It's important to talk about, and that there is a growing of a growing sensitivity to the theme of racism among leftist party and among people in general. In the last election here last week, we had an increase in the numbers of Black local parliamentarians, but uh, I still sorry about some points because the historical refusal of the Marxist left to address racism forced Black movements to organize himself separately, and the result is it is a Black movement that does not think about class. That's a problem because Black people in Brazil are majoritarily working class, but Black movement don't think in class terms. That's the first problem. But the other problem is a kind of class movement or Marxist movement that does not consider the centrality of racism to understand the economic framework in Brazil. I think the raise of rope is in the possibility to fix it, to create other framework where we can articulate these efforts to building another society.
Thank you very much for that focus on the issue of the race of hope, particularly the attention you drew to the universal health system and the fact that that was the war between Brazil and absolute disaster, but also the new stirrings of the Black movement, and most importantly, the point about the fact that this movement does not pay sufficient attention to class questions, and also that the Marxist organizations do not pay sufficient attention to race, and therefore this being a very important aspect of what to do going forward in order to see more robust movements against the counter-revolution. At this juncture, I'd like to call Lenosome and then Pravinja to put some questions that they have. Thank you. Len first, please.
Okay, thank you, Georgie, and thank you, Davison, for your talk. So I have two questions. One is, you spoke of a gradual accommodation from above in the COVID response. So could you speak more about the conditions and the kinds of negotiations and the kinds of considerations that you think led to this kind of accommodation? That is one. And two, so this is, a bit maybe polemical, but do you think that given the character of Bolsonaro's regime, that a non-racist response would have been possible or expected? So in a sense, what are the demands of the Black movements that are emerging? What kinds of demands do you think the regime could have been expected to respond to, within this time? And also just a comment on your last point about these new movements not articulating a class critique. I mean, I hear this a lot, and there's always a temptation to call them, to just dismiss them as identitarian. But I think that part of it is, when you think of Issa Shivji's notion, and others' notion of working people, the notion that has been floating around a lot of the precariat. I mean, maybe the existing paradigms do not articulate, because these people are poor. They have no doubt that, they're poor and they're working class and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, are there other ways to understand what they're articulating? Because as you very well said, they're stuck in this historical and structural inequality, cycles of inequality, whether it's health or education, without just saying, okay, these guys are not talking about class in the sort of historical way in which we understand it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And then Praveen, please, before we ask Davison to take the floor again.
Thank you, Sister Judge. Davison, that was a very, very illuminating in terms of many issues. And congratulations to you for this talk, raising extremely important concerns and so on. A few thoughts for your further reflections. Number one, you talked of the Constitution and the universal health kind of, in a sense, promise, yeah, in the 1988 Constitution and so on. As it happens, we have seen this in many countries around the world. Yeah, that is, Constitution guarantees something. In practice, there is massive violation of that, or very differential kind of implementation of that. So, Constitution itself is hardly a kind of assurance that what is said will certainly be done. Yeah, I mean, Indian Constitution is supposed to be one of the best in the world, right? I'm saying this not because I'm an Indian, but there's generally a lot of appreciation for our Constitution. Article 39B, it says that every person will have adequate resources for a life of dignity. I mean, it's a fantastic kind of provision. Zilch, nothing happens, right? Huge majority of the population is just left for the devil to devour them, right? So, this whole kind of accent on the institution, which can ensure or institutional processes which can ensure what the Constitution had promised and so on. That includes politics, that includes a whole range of movements and so on and so forth. If you would like to say a little more on that, let's say the decade of that last century after 1988 for a while, right? the Lula period, how apparently, presumably, there was some improvement in some of those aspects. What were the factors driving those? Sort of, as we know very well, that Lula could not break out of a kind of neoliberal mode. He could not really challenge the corporate power. However, within that, through a range of sort of possibilities that he created, essentially backed by greater mobilization of resources, large part of which came from direct taxation. Tax GDP ratio goes up. I think this was astounding, unprecedented, by something like 10 to 12%, right, over a period of roughly, a decade or so. And through that, he certainly, it seems, that regime certainly kind of implement a little more in terms of whether it was issues relating to health, whether it is issues relating to food security and so on and so forth. Yeah, I mean, you know it better than I do, right? So if you could, for all of us who do not know Brazil so well, could reflect on some of these in terms of how a set of synergies or the absence of that possibly facilitated achievement of, or the lack of achievement during the period since 1988, that would be certainly valuable for us. True, I mean, it is indeed the case that anywhere in the world, what a national regime can do is very sort of severely hampered by its insertion into the broader neoliberal kind of framework, right? But that keeps changing. Paris talked about what I call the axis of the good against the axis of the evil. And by axis of the evil, I mean the US and so on and so forth. And there was, so in Latin America, you had for a while sort of coming together of progressive forces. And that to me was, polemically speaking, the axis of the good, right? Now, what brought it to its weakening? Some of those, again, connect. So, instead of thinking in terms of, let's say, neoliberalism versus sort of a kind of structural racism and so on, but there is a dynamic interaction between the two. And if you would like to talk a little more about that. The third issue, sometimes I feel that, sort of straw person of the so-called Marxism or Marxist gets created. So when you sort of use a blanket expression called the Marxist left, right? Now that, to my mind, possibly is not a good way of going about it. I imagine you are a Marxist. I imagine Paris is a Marxist, and many of us, including the chair of this session, sort of yours truly, all of us in different ways certainly subscribe to the Marxist method, and within that, then we have lots of differences as well, and so on. So I guess possibly a more nuanced way of treating, I guess, the Marxist left in Brazil may be desirable, instead of just putting them in some pigeonhole and thinking of that as a kind of, let's say, a separate box compared to those who are talking about, or rather kind of emphasizing the centrality of the race factor and so on. I guess there are, again, lots of combinations there, and in terms of approaches and so on. And the very last point, which is rays of hope, that is something you flagged and then Paris talked about and so on. What kind of, forces and combinations which you see on the ground, not in terms of simply the desirability of it, right? You talked about some electoral outcomes very recently, which gives us maybe a little bit of optimism. But on the ground, what are the kind of processes and forces and so on? Because that really is a huge question everywhere in the world, right? How sort of incessant and infinite strategies of divide and rule. Okay, so for instance, in Florida, apparently sort of majority of Latinos backed Trump. Now, doesn't make sense, right? And likewise, if you look at state by state and so on, all kinds of very interesting stats are coming. So what you would associate with, let's say, certain kinds of social groups, it does not happen automatically, right? So-called working people, overwhelming majority of working people in India are backing a fascist regime, right? Now, it's utterly troubling. Why does that happen? But you can understand it once you understand that it is because of a certain kind of fascist ideology. Hindutva is something which is at the center of it, right? And how that kind of others, significant social group, right? So, that then ensures coming together even of those on the margin, those who are, those who should be talking in a different language, thinking differently and so on. So, many of these issues, so in the context of Brazil, if you would like to flag some of these things, I guess that would be sort of pretty enlightening in terms of thinking about rays of hope. So, sister, I should stop here, no? Otherwise, I'll probably take too much time. Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay.
But thank you so much for those important questions. And Davison, before you speak, I'd like to draw your attention to some interesting questions in the chat. So Vanessa Pfeiffer Colonial is asking, Prof. Davison, do you think those rays of hope could be as well empowered by taking seriously the ideas of some Brazilian Black women intellectuals, such as Lelia Gonzalez or Sueli Carneiro, in their approach on structural racism by the Brazilian academics, in the same way considering and learning by the long trajectory of resistance that Black and Indigenous people have been mobilizing long time, and provide strategies as well for the COVID issue? So that's one. Gabriela Chavez says, how do you evaluate the emergency policies of this crisis? So now you have a lot on your plate. So you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you for that topics and question and issue. I talk about gradual accommodation of above for problematize the Brazilian response, because in the second moment, in the first moment, there was a ignorance of government about coronavirus, but when it was impossible to ignore pandemic, the response was based by a kind of ambiguity and fighting between estadual government and federal government and the fighting was fighting for blackout, for blackout, no, sorry, for quarantine, for social response for COVID-19. But the polarization created by Bolsonaro won the fight, because he created the not only he, but he was part of that line of view where exists the polarization between health and economy, and they choose economy. And I think that argument was important to create a kind of accommodation of above, because in the third moment, even that local government that defended quarantine flexibilized it and stopped massive efforts to limit social circulation, for example, and it creates a kind of consensus between them uh, in terms of idea of centrality to economy. That is so problematic point of view, because we need to be live to produce, to improving economy, but that shows was so dramatic for poor people, because without governmental efforts uh, to stop circulation, people needs do that alone. But a worker class cannot say for then entrepreneur, then chief, that I will not go to the work today because there are coronavirus. That was so dramatic for working class, because who can stay at home protecting himself about coronavirus is the rich people, is a part of Brazilian population. The most of part of population needs to be in a full collective transport, need to be in risk of infection and risk of death, because even when the numbers of infection were most frequent in rich class, was the poor people and black peoples that more people that die more with coronavirus. And but that debate cannot exist. There was the idea that pandemic was a democratic problem. Everyone can be affected by it, but that's not really, that is lie, because the virus, the SARS-CoV-2, cannot see race and class and gender, but the social conditions to SARS-CoV-2 to disseminate are social, are social, and that create different conditions to infection and death. But this debate was not did sufficiently to, and we had not forced to change the social policy for that, and the poor people was without protection about it. Uh, uh, I think that is one point. Other topic was about the demands of black movements in Brazil. That's interesting because Black movement in Brazil are so complex, and there are different line of interpretation, different theoretical influence uh, uh, among Black movement, and we can talk about Black movement in plural because there are different Black movement in Brazil, and Black movement can be understood in the context of general social movements in Brazil, because Black movement is part of a major conjuncture. But when we see some topics presented by Black movement, we can see that there are two big topics. I think one topic is the defense for universal demands. For example, the protection of universal system of health, the protection of university and public education system, or combating poverty. There are some demands presented by Black movements that are democratic demands. Abdias Nascimento, an important thinker, Afro-Brazilian thinker, calls about quilombismo. Quilombismo is like Marronism, or it's like an important movement of important Black movement in Brazil in the period of in the slavery period, and Abdias calls about necessity to think the social projects in terms of quilombism, in terms of social justice, but that social justice is not only the modern approach of justice, but is also incorporation of African and indigenous way of life, and African and indigenous knowledge in that social project of justice. And but Abdias Nascimento was the intellectual important in the time, in the moment of our constitution, but he was not read by important thinkers from left, for example, and his project, his quilombist project, was not incorporated by important thinker and scholar that are thinking capitalism in Brazil. But one topic of Black movement is the universal demands, but there is also the ask for affirmative actions that recognize the African knowledge and culture, that recognize Afro-Brazilian experience. That's two topics, but there are different forms of think those two topics in Black movement agenda, and I think that is an important part of Black movement today, that created a kind of resentment with left, because left, the thinkers left, or left thinker, I don't know, didn't think about racism in their agenda, and that create a kind of resentment. That's so problematic because created the false idea that it's possible to respond Black problem, or respond racism without think Brazilian capitalism and economic issues. I think it's so problematic approach, but there is such an approach in Brazil. That's important to think the limits of identity policies, because that is for me, I am I study Frantz Fanon, Kwame Nkrumah, and Patsy Lumumba and Ho Chi Minh, and when I read these intellectuals, I think that there is a difference in the identity policy processed by Bandung spirituals, for example, and the identity policies uh, processed by, for example, post-colonial British thinker, for example, that I think there are different responses to racism, and the Black movement today uh, are is in center of dispute between different perspective, theoric and political perspective. And I think that Bandung spirituals is the possibility to defend subordinate identity without lost the universal perspective. But I think that that is others perspectives in the field today, and we are that topics are in debate today. Uh, uh, but I think, and I agree with Frantz Fanon, that considerate identity uh, uh, is important to think about relationship, theoretical relationship between particular and universal aspect. And we don't need choose between universal or particular aspect. We can think the dialectical relationship between them. That is a point. About Brazilian constitution is an interesting topic because our legal advance were against the neoliberal wave of the late 20th century. It was because we was in a social pressure. We had a major strike in previous ways. For example, there was an important rise of movement in the period of our constitution, but the following government after that moment was marked by a kind we are adjusting the state to neoliberalism and the structural crisis of capital necessity, and that creates a kind of contradiction because we had a beautiful constitution. Our constitution calls for important demands of social movements from the land, from the urban place, important achievement, constitutional achievement, but the social condition creates difficult to a state provide that what is there. But we can think also about the limits of the state to provide social justice in the capitalist system. But the constitution was not a socialist constitution, but create the idea, the possibility of a kind of welfare state. But that welfare state present in constitution is only present in constitution because we didn't uh, be able to practice that achievement, and that creates real difficult. But is interesting because today Bolsonaro government says that the first task for them is break constitution. We could not practice constitution, but constitution continue being an important achievement, an important social achievement that we need defend it because there are important social demands. But Lula is a complex analysis. It's complex analyze Lula government because Lula was, for me, Lula was an achievement. Lula was achievement of the working class in Brazil. Lula was important part of mobilization and reception or governmental reception of social demands. And Lula was possible due to Brazil position in the international commodities market in 2008 crisis, for example. That's create the possibility to Brazil stay in the particular place when different scouting was at crisis. And that process create the possibility to incorporate poor people in market and incorporate in government incorporate a kind of popular project. But my point is that that moment was marked by a pact, a kind of pact between a dominant class and working class, and that pact create the impossibility to rising to advance with this changing, and the result was a fragile achievement, and when we had a popular project, we had an important achievement, but it was not deeply raised to change the real situation, but even create important achievement. But when that project was not important more for dominant class, for example, that project was discarded, and working class had not forced to defend its project. And I think Lula government was complex because we had, in one hand, the incorporation of demanding, of social demanding, of work demanding, but on the other hand, we had a kind of institutionalization of social movement, and believe in the institutional way as a unique way to guarantee the achievement. But when that project was discarded by dominant class in Brazil, the social class, the social workers and social movement was so weak and fragile, and because it was almost totally institutionalized, and that creates problem to resist of changing of political scenario. And that's interesting because that creates a great debate in Brazil about the possibility to do a kind of self-critique of left, where we was wrong. How can we do different now, because we had a loss. And that debate is part of current scenario, and Marxism is part of this debate, because we had a non-Marxist way of democratic project of social justice by Lula government, for example. And some intellectuals cause about that limit of laws, of a radical perspective in that project. But for on the other hand, thinking Marxism today is important to think the limits of Brazilians Marxist, historical Marxist, to thinking important problems in Brazil, like gender, race, and environment, etc. That debate is present in left today, and is an important debate. And I think it's a contemporary debate because we can put in the scenario the possibility to think in hope, uh, uh, because the posture of left was not think in the hope, but think today, think and organize the rule, organize the society like us. It is organized today, but I think the possibility of criticize Marxism or put Marxism in debate is the possibility to dream with other society. I think the hope, the rays of hope, is here also to dream in another form of society, but that needs to be building in this society, and we need to facing this problem, the real problem, the contemporary extant problem. They are marked by a combination of race, class, gender, homophobia, and etc. And for last, I want to talk about fascism, because that is so complex issue also, because I agree with the thinker that calls about raising of new fascism in Brazil, because if we see in the political aspect, we have all the topics of fascism, but I think we need to contextualize the debate about it, because historically, if we think Italian fascism or German fascism, fascism was a political response by monopoly capital from backward country to compete with a central country. But when we see, and I am reading Fanon here in Wretched, What the Earth, when we see colonial bourgeoisie, or colonial bourgeoisie is not like the Prussian bourgeoisie, a kind of bourgeoisie like wants to be in the high. Our bourgeoisie was created by colonialism, was created to be a part of imperialist process, and never wanted to compete or guarantee an autonomous path. I think to talk about only fascism without considering that particularity, that colonial particularity, is can be let us can be difficult interpretation of this reality. And my problem, my question is how the our colonial roots help us explain the contemporary problem and limits. That's the point. And I think to answer it, we need to read important intellectuals like Lélia Gonzalez and Sueli Carneiro, and others, and Fernanda Lopes and Jurema Werneck, and there are important thinkers, Black women and Black men thinkers, thinking Brazil, not only thinking racism or thinking Black experience, but thinking response to Brazilian problem and the international crisis in Brazil. But the racism is part of kind of invisibility of that intellectuals also. And in the university, that names are not knowledge, because people don't know Sueli Carneiro or Lélia Gonzalez, but Lélia Gonzalez offers important important intellectual material, important contribution to understand the particularity of Latin America, or Lélia Gonzalez calls about Ladino America or América, Ladino América, because she said that we are not Latino because there are a different fight even in the culture field where other cultures resist and create different way of life that stay here in America, but we think America only in Eurocentric way and disconsiderate the importance of that experience, that way of life, but that theoric production of Black and Indigenous people. That is an important challenge for progressive force, Marxist or non-Marxist, but the important task for progressive force is incorporate Indigenous and African knowledge, but they usually they don't did it, and our better thinker are still white people in America, in Bolivia, in Uruguay, in Nicaragua, but that are indigenous and African societies also. That is a task. I think it's important to read Rui Mauro Marini when he said about over-exploitation of workforce, but it's important to read also Mariátegui when he calls the importance to consider the indigenous question in the left task, in the left struggle. And in Brazil, we have Lélia Gonzalez, we have Clóvis Moura, we have important thinkers talking about this. I think our task is fixed that face opposition between race and class, because racism is part of our particular way of structuration of capitalism.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have exactly 3 minutes left, so unfortunately we will not be able to take on any more questions. But I really wanted to thank you, Davidson, for what has been an illuminating 2 hours. You shocked us. You spoke about the over 166,000 deaths in Brazil, most of them of Black people. And you talked about the fact that this was possible in spite of one of the most progressive universal healthcare systems in the world. You also shocked us by drawing attention to the fact that no serious outrage has been expressed in Brazil and elsewhere about this shocking statistic of Black deaths. And this is in the context of worldwide protests like Black Lives Matter movements and so on. And also the recent anti-SARS protests in Africa's most populous nation, Nigeria. In that way, you really made us to understand that epidemiological problems cannot be understood without a deep understanding of the capitalist systems around the world. And in this case, the particular variant in Brazil, which is steeped in colonialism and racism. And this has been really important. You also allowed us to talk about rays of hope in this situation. The very health system that you mentioned, new formations to address the crisis, particularly formations of Black movements, but also you allowed us to talk about the possibility of broader social movements and struggles led by the oppressed. We also managed to talk about the importance of constitutions, progressive constitutions, but at the same time, there are limitations in neoliberal capitalist systems, and therefore how to work around them. I think Brazil's predicament raises a very important question for all of us, and it is this: how working people and progressive social movements around the world can protect hard-won socioeconomic and political gains from the inevitability of the counter-revolution and prevail. I think this is a subject of many more seminars that we should hold, definitely, because I think this is a question that concerns all of us around the globe. I also want to thank Paris for very important insights, for helping us to deepen our understanding of the complexities of Brazil. Thank you very much, participants, for your insights, questions, and so on. And thanks to the supporting partners, especially to our tricontinental logistics team, particularly Joseph Mathai, Freedom Mazui, Nabajit Malaka, Esha Chowdhury, Priyanka Kula, and Julio Kambanku. I want to announce to you that the next session in our dialogue series will be on December 2nd with Dr. Max Agil, who will talk to us on the subject of a people's Green New Deal, obstacles and prospects. And I hope all of you will join us, but also spread the word so that we can have a larger gathering. With these few words, I would now like to declare this webinar ended. And thank you so much for participating, and have a good day, wherever you may be.
Thank you, Davison. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.